Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our Friday Fireside Chat. I'm Rita McGrath, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here with my friend, Professor Jeffrey Pfeffer from Stanford. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get going. This is being recorded, so don't say anything or type anything you don't want captured for posterity. Good general principle. And it will take about an hour. I'll try to keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A, so if you have questions, feel free to populate them there. Without further ado, welcome, Jeff.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you. So for those of you who possibly don't know Jeff Pfeffer, he's an absolute icon in the world of people and management. 10 books, I think. Absolutely. 15. Oh God, I miscounted. 15 books, and countless articles. And one of the few people who's very well respected both in academic circles, but also by practitioners, and firmly, rooted in what goes on in reality. And one of the things I've always appreciated about Jeff's take on the world is how he can take something we take for granted and almost don't think about and kind of flip it on its head. So as an example, I was reading one of your recent pieces on pay and why low pay doesn't actually necessarily save cost. And I ran across this phrase that you said is that the rate of pay is not synonymous with labor costs. And I thought that was so interesting because it makes you think, right? So you can have actually higher rates of pay. And as my friend Zainab Tan has often pointed out, if you have a higher commitment workforce, it can really pay off. So your most recent book is Dying for a Paycheck, which if you guys don't have it, you should get it. It's really a terrific read. And I thought maybe to get started, you could run us through some of the core arguments that you lay out there.
Well, it turns out the title was more prescient than I thought at the time, because I knew that people were literally going to be dying for a paycheck, as they are in some Amazon warehouses and whatever. But the premise of the book is actually pretty simple, and it's still true, and it's unfortunately still the case, and that is that over the last 50, 60, 70, 80 years, organizations and societies really all over the world have cleaned up the physical toll in the workplace of things like accidents and chemical spills and and having your hand cut off in a saw or mining accidents. So the physical safeties issues in workplaces have been largely cleaned up. They're certainly much better in the United States, and they're actually much better around the world. But in the meantime, the psychosocial stressors of the workplace, things that come from economic insecurity, layoffs, not knowing your schedule, things that come from an absence of job control or control over your life, work-family conflict, stress, depression, etc., have actually gone up quite a bit. And so the workplace remains a very, in too many places, a very toxic place. That there is research, including some research that I recently completed with some colleagues, that shows that not surprisingly, depression prospectively predicts diseases such as cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. So it's not, when people say, well, it's just in your mind, it isn't. It goes from the mind to other physical illnesses. It is not surprising. There's a lot of research which I review in Dying for a Paycheck, but it is not surprising that healthy people are more productive. That stressed people are more likely to turn over, that people who come to work and are concerned about their well-being are more likely to show up with presenteeism, not being able to focus on what they're doing. And so the costs to companies from an unhealthy workforce, and both the direct costs, of course, paying for healthcare, but the indirect costs of presenteeism, absenteeism, turnover is enormous. Many of the estimates are in excess of $1 trillion a year. And so we have created, with these workplaces which are unhealthy, what I would call a lose-lose situation. The people are losing because they're stressed and unhealthy, and the companies are losing because they're facing unnecessarily high turnover, presenteeism and lost work days through absenteeism. And so we ought to try to make workplaces healthier. That is basically the story of dying for a paycheck.
And you have some fascinating illustrations in the book of things like externalities of bad jobs, essentially, and mention the case of San Francisco. And I thought that was really interesting, where they forced employers essentially to cover a minimum level of healthcare for their employees. And you know, and you hear this all the time, you know, employers screaming about, oh, you know, I can't afford, if you raise the minimum wage, I can't afford to pay benefits, I can't afford all this stuff. And yet in San Francisco, the earth did not end, right? The sky did not.
Yes. Well, the earth has ended now with COVID, but prior to COVID, there's no evidence that affected business badly. And as you pointed out in the introduction, you know, I think this idea that cost minimization is the objective of business is, I think, wrong. I mean, if you want to minimize costs, close down. On the day you close, your cost will be zero. Your job is not, in fact, to minimize costs. Your job is to maximize the difference between what you pay and what you get. And oftentimes, higher paid people are more skilled, or they're more engaged, or they're more motivated, or they're maybe more all of the above. So the idea that you can somehow make more money by just paying people less or cutting their medical costs is just insane. And as you use the phrase, which I think is right, externalized. I mean, you know, if I do not provide healthcare to my employees and my employees get sick, we really have two choices. We can let them die on the street, or someone else will take care of them and someone else will pay. And we have externalized those costs. And it is completely unclear to me as to why it is either fair, just, or right for an employer to say, you know, I'm going to hire you, Rita. I'm not going to pay unemployment insurance for you. I'm not going to pay into a pension plan. I'm not going to pay for your health insurance. But when you retire or when you get sick, someone else will somehow pick up the cost that I was not responsible for.
Right. And yet you've shown very compellingly in your research that, you know, better employees, more productive employees actually increase the top line. And I think you cited the case of Costco versus Walmart.
Yeah.
And Costco pays like an order of magnitude more than Walmart, but the revenue per employee is that much more substantial.
It's interesting. In almost every other market, we expect that you get what you pay for. In the labor market, somehow everybody thinks they're going to get a bargain. I'm going to pay you nothing, but somehow you're going to do just as good work. And you see this in the academic labor market. I mean, if I want to hire Rita McGrath, I'm going to have to pay you more than some temporary assistant professor that I hire off the street. And it's one of the reasons why, you know, MBA students would choose to go to Columbia to have better professors. They understand. I mean, if all you wanted was a professor, you can get one off the street.
Totally. You can get one on Zoom. I'm sure there's professors for sale on Zoom right now.
I'm sure.
So one of your more recent pieces, you talked a little bit about, you know, how to manage people during the pandemic. You know, what are some principles for managing, you know, remote workers and freaked out workers and people that are frightened. And kind of, I'll just run down the list. So principle one, kind of avoid layoffs. Two is prioritize, figure out what's urgent, right? Provide backup so people feel supported. Appreciate the tensions between work and family, kind of try to make those fair. Assess how people are doing, and allow them to unleash their creativity. And when you go through that list, I mean, doesn't that sound like how we'd want to be treated at work in normal times too?
Yes. I mean, one of the interesting things is that what is good for managing people during the crisis is basically to take the sound management principles that too few companies used all the time and put them into place. People want economic security all the time. People, you know, is the words of one of my friends who I quoted in that article. She says, every day is take your child to work day, because every day, whether or not your kid is physically with you, they are psychologically with you in the sense that you are concerned about their well-being and they're concerned about the care that they're getting and whatever. And this idea that somehow you could push the kids away and that there was a separate part of life was incorrect. The idea that you would want to have people engaged and give them some sense of responsibility is something that we've talked about literally for decades. So yes, good management during COVID is not much different than good management all the time. And it should not take a crisis to remind us of what we need to be doing.
Mm-hmm. So what are some remedies, do you think, for, the sort of dying for a paycheck, stressful, toxic workplace problems? And our mutual friend Bob Sutton has a wonderful phrase to describe workplaces like that.
Yes.
And are there some remedies that we could collectively perhaps agree to?
Well, I don't know if we could agree to them. I say the first thing I say to people is employees is I say to them, if you were in a building and the building was filling up with smoke, and you asked me what you should do, or ask anybody what you should do, and the smoke was toxic, of course, the recommendation would be to leave the building. And that is my first recommendation. If you're in a toxic workplace where your mental and physical well-being is being placed at risk by what the company is doing with and to you and, and about you and whatever, your first responsibility and your first thing you ought to try to do is you ought to try to leave. You shouldn't do what many people do, which is to say, oh, it'll get better, or oh, I have super lungs and I can breathe in this toxic workplace, or I'm tough. It affects many other people, but it won't affect me, and I'll tough it out and all this other stuff. If you're in an unhealthy environment, you need to try to find a different environment. That is, I think that's the individual's responsibility to try to find the place where they can thrive, to use a word that's been used a lot, but I think it's an appropriate word. You need to be in a place where you can succeed, where you can thrive. Absent that, I wish I could say that organizations who listen to your podcast and other podcasts are becoming more enlightened and are becoming better and are becoming more humane and are becoming, all these wonderful things. I don't really see it. I think if we're going to change, so if you ask what changed occupational safety and health at the physical level, it was legislation, regulation, and litigation. We created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which enforced workplace physical safety. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration in the US and comparable agencies in other countries, including Chile, are perfectly able and capable and have the knowledge to create workplaces which are safe in a psychosocial way. They have not necessarily have the resources or the freedom to do that, but they certainly could. But absent that, I think if you wait for companies to voluntarily do the right thing, some of them will. I mean, there are companies like Patagonia, there are companies like Barry Way Miller, there are companies, that are like the Southwest Airlines, whatever. I mean, there are obviously companies that think of their people, think of themselves as communities, take responsibility, a word which is often missing in today's dialogue, take responsibility for all of their stakeholders, including their employees, and try to do things as best as they can. But those companies, I would say, are in a minority. We can talk about whether they're in a small minority or a tiny minority or whatever, but if you wait for companies to do the right thing, I think you'll be waiting for a long time. And so it is going to require some kind of intervention, and we will see if and when that happens. And the intervention could come from a collective organization like a labor union or a quasi-labor union. You see now when these warehouses and grocery stores, people are saying, I don't feel the company is sufficiently protecting me, sufficiently disinfecting, providing me with sufficient protective equipment. And so therefore I'm going to try to organize with my coworkers or, in France organize with the government or something to try to create a higher standard of, in this case, epidemiological protection. So it requires individuals to take action. It requires collective action, and it requires the government to understand that at the end of the day, the government is paying for this. So, when I make you sick in the workplace and you leave the labor force, it's the government that winds up paying anyway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's interesting thinking about the this notion that if you're a parent, your kids are in your workplace, whether they're physically there or not. And one of the grimmer predictions that I've heard is a lot of the daycare centers, a lot of the childcare facilities aren't going to make it through this this period of enforced inactivity. And it'll be kind of interesting to see how workplaces respond to that, because and it's also very interesting that at least in the US, it's one of the countries in the world where care, where schooling is publicly supported, but not at a really young age. So schooling for really young kids isn't really supported.
And that is, of course, led. I have a friend who's running this company, which obviously, ironically, is providing services for working families. But she says, she says, I'm a CEO, I'm running a daycare center, and I'm running a school. And, because she's got a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old. And so she's doing all of these things from home. And I don't think people, I think companies say, well, you can work from home. And they have not really thought about it, fine, who else is at home with you? You may not be home by yourself. You may have your child or children of various ages who've been sent home by the school. And I know certainly in the San Francisco Bay Area, both Oakland and the city of San Francisco, when they first closed the schools, they basically sent home to the parents lesson plans on Monday, and that was it. So we now are running an experiment in which a massive fraction of the students are being homeschooled because the schools basically are not doing very much.
Exactly. And it is a massive experiment. And, we one of the things we do know about education for younger children is, this stuff is all cumulative and path dependent. And so if the path gets interrupted, it's not completely sure where it'll go. We had 2 questions come in on the chat. One was about measuring presenteeism. And I know you've got a whole chapter in the book on metrics for various kinds of health outcomes and how you could find them and so forth. So is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, I mean, if people go to scholar.google.com, you can find validated measures for almost all of this, including presenteeism, and including obviously absenteeism and employee engagement, which has been an issue for a long time, and people's mental and physical health. There are scales that have been well developed and well validated, and I would encourage people to use them. I mean, presenteeism is a real phenomenon. It's interesting. There's an organization called Vitality, which is part of a large insurance company. They run a survey called British Health, BHW, British Healthiest Workplaces Survey. And they have found 2 statistics which ought to shock everybody, and I think it is not unique for Britain. Number 1, the level of moderate to severe depression has quadrupled in the last 5 years, which is an extraordinary number. And people who have followed the level of depression in the US have seen, I think they're called deaths of despair, the rise in suicides, the rise in the use of antidepressants, the rise in depression has been severe. And the second thing that they have found is that presenteeism accounts for about, so the British Healthiest Workplace Survey has a measure, it's I'm sure not a perfect measure, of productivity, lost productivity, and the loss due to presenteeism is 10 times the loss due to absenteeism. So basically for every day of people actually physically not showing up at work because they're sick or mentally disturbed or whatever, there's 10 times the loss in terms of productivity lost by presenteeism. Wow. So I would encourage people, that's reported There are surveys each year are reported in the Financial Times. I would encourage people to look at the British Healthiest Workplace Survey for these data, which are shocking. I mean, basically, their estimate is that companies are losing more than a month of work per employee on average, and the worst, of course, are doing worse.
Wow, that's stunning. That is absolutely stunning.
Well, it's stunning if you're not familiar with the data. The data are pretty ugly. I mean, in terms of the rate of depression and mental distress in the U.S. and around the world. There's a list which I think you can find online of the 10 most depressed countries. The U.S. is not number one. I think actually India is number one, and China is certainly in the top three. And the cost of this, in terms of both the pharmaceutical costs, but also the cost in terms of lost productive work days, lost days, is just enormous. We need to take mental health much more seriously, and understand, companies need to understand that the workplace is not the only source of physical and mental distress, but it is a source, and it's a place that we ought to really try to remedy things.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a comment, any best practices post-19? I would refer everybody to Jeff's recent blog post on that. And it's on, I think it's on a blog called Future of Work, or Work Future, Rework, something like that. But you've written a whole extensive piece on what that looks like. So I think that'd be a great resource. Another question was about call centers. And having actual human beings to communicate with when you have a problem with some problem your company's producing. I had this a couple of days ago, the battle to get through my cable provider's armies of robots to get to a person, because my problem was a unique one and not accounted for in their menu of options. Any thoughts on that? There's been a ton of research actually that shows that companies that provide better customer service tend to have more loyal customers, less turnover, and so forth on the customer side.
Yes, and as you know, and as your experience really illustrates, people hate these AVR, automated voice response systems. And there's on the web secrets to how to get around them, but it's an arms race, and they've like done away with all the secrets and whatever. And it is, I think, extremely frustrating and difficult. And the COVID thing has made the problem worse, because more people are trying to call, and they have not necessarily, the companies have not necessarily upgraded their staffing proportionally. So, if you call Walmart has misbilled me, and I will eventually, I guess, deal with this with my credit card. So you call Walmart, you don't call Walmart, you go on a chat at Walmart, and it says, we will call you back sometime after 3 hours. It is a 3-hour wait to be called back from Walmart. And so I was called back by Walmart, and I thought, like, wow. And I described the fact that they had double billed me for the same order. And she said, well, she says, our billing department is closed, and I cannot help you. And so you have to, so I said, well, what do you recommend? And she said, well, I recommend that you call back at approximately 5 in the morning, your time, which will be at approximately 8 in the morning, our time. So by the time in the 3 hours they will call you back, the billing department will still be open, and they can resolve your problem. And so the idea that you would have people so it's bad enough that you have to wait 3 hours to get through to a human being, but then you get through to a human being who is not empowered to actually resolve the problem. Mm-hmm. And by the way, I made a post on this also. The difference between Walmart and Amazon is just stunning. I think Walmart, the experience I've had with Walmart has been horrible. Their delivery times, they don't honor. They're out of stock of everything. Dealing with them on the phone is like ridiculous. And Amazon, I think, has done a much, even though Amazon, of course, is hard on their employees, and that's something else we could talk about. But Amazon, I think, has done a much superior job of providing a much better customer experience than either Walmart or Target. And at the end, Amazon will own the market for that very reason.
Mm. Well, it's interesting when you think about anchoring a company, and how different companies are sort of anchored on different things. And Amazon, and I really do believe this because I've spoken to a lot of people who've been working there, really genuinely anchored on the customer. And some of that expresses itself in ways that I don't particularly find tasteful, but they are absolutely, if you think about the chain of experiences I talk about that customers go through, they've probably got 50 things they're doing at each of those experiences that just make it easier, better, less frictionless, and so forth. Walmart, in contrast, was always chained on cost, was always sort of anchored on cost. And so if you're anchored on cost, and your idea of how to furnish your waiting room is you have, samples left over from a vendor as the plastic chairs that are there. I mean, I've heard stories like this. But if that's where you're anchored and your whole competitive advantage is just being much more efficient. And of course, the case studies, right? They invented cross-docking. They invented sort of global up to the minute supply chain logistics before that was even a known thing, and so forth. And I think what becomes interesting over time, right, is the cost advantage thing, unless you are dramatically, either in a place where nobody else can match you or dramatically different, eventually people will catch up. They'll figure that out. And maybe not the whole model, but they'll figure out pieces of the model. Whereas the customer piece, as Bezos himself says, he says, customers are always delightfully, happily, wonderfully dissatisfied. And our job is to find out those moments of dissatisfaction. And that means our path forward is always going to be sort of open. And it's very interesting to contrast the two. So some years ago, you wrote a fantastic book, and I think this may be where we first met, when you were promoting the book Power, and how to think about power in an organizational setting. And I've actually thought that was a really strong message, because the idea is that power is not something to shy away from, right? That if you're going to be successful, that power becomes something you really need to be developing. And I think of this especially poignantly because I run a course at Columbia, an executive course called Women in Leadership. And you say to your typical executive woman attending a Women in Leadership course, well, you really should seek to become powerful. And they're like, oh, that makes them very uncomfortable. So I wondered if you could just share some of the insights in your work on power and perhaps some tips for our audience.
Well, I teach an online class as part of Stanford's online program on this material, and I teach an elective, which has turned out to become the most popular elective at Stanford Business School, called the Paths to Power. And I think the reason why it is the most popular elective is because it is, if anybody knows anything about Stanford, it has become the most countercultural course. Because as Rita has suggested, and I think is completely right, I think this is true for women, it's true for minorities, I think it's true probably for everybody to some extent. You say, you're powerful or you're ambitious. That's another word that oftentimes makes women uncomfortable. We call ambitious. That's like a bad thing. No, it's actually not a bad thing. It's a good thing. So I try to teach people what to do to become more powerful and how to become more accepting and comfortable with power. I tell them on the very first day of class, in my on-campus class, that we're going to have the 4 stages of the course, and the first stage will be denial, where the stuff that we're going to talk to them about doesn't apply to me, or it doesn't apply to high tech, or it doesn't apply in finance, or it doesn't apply in small companies, or it doesn't apply
or not-for-profits. Not-for-profits. We got some comments about not-for-profits too.
Not-for-profits, of course. So we're going to try to get them past the denial stage, and then they will get angry, mostly at me, about how can any human being, talk about the kinds of people that we talk about and the principles that they use, and then they will go into sadness, where isn't this? Yes, I see this is the way the world is, and I'm depressed. And finally, if we are successful, which we are in a reasonable number of cases, though not in 100% of the time, they will come to acceptance. And acceptance is that this is the way the world it is, and it is, and these are the principles of power, and you have a choice. And I think your Women in Leadership class is a perfect example of this. You can opt in, or you can opt out. Women don't have to be leaders. Women don't have to be in the workforce. Women don't have to, be powerful. Women don't have to take responsibility. Women can, as men can, opt out. But if you're going to opt in, you need to opt in and understand the game that you're in, and understand what you're going to have to do if you're going to succeed in that game. Because, I tell people, you can certainly not pursue power, but the thing that drives me nuts is people who say, I would like to get this job, I would like to be in this position of power, but I'm not willing to do what it takes.
Right.
And that, so you don't have to do what it takes. You don't have to be in the position of power, but you can't say, I want to be in this position, but I refuse to do what is required. That to me seems like completely ridiculous.
Yeah, I agree. So give us some examples of what's required. What are some of the sort of things that you look for in people that are navigating this power dynamic successfully?
Well, I think, some of the stuff is, I think, reasonably obvious. Power in organizations is, in fact, a social relationship. In the words of my friend Keith Ferrazzi, on whom I wrote a case, who wrote the famous book, Never Eat Alone, he said, your driving ambition is not going to get you anywhere. It is going to be other people who are going to put you in positions of power. And so therefore you need relationships with people. I think in the women in power literature, I think, what's her name? Sylvia Ann Hewitt has this wonderful phrase, women have too many mentors and not enough sponsors.
Yes.
So you need to build relationships with people who will advocate on your behalf. Mentors give advice, sponsors give promotions. And you need more people giving you promotions than advice. Advice is pretty much cheap. So you need to build a significant number of relationships with people who can be helpful to you in your career. Some of these people you may not like. Some of them you may not respect. That is not a good, I think we come into the world much too evaluative. We're asked to evaluate and make judgments all the time. I point out to people that Matthew 7 says, judge not that you be not judged. The Quran says only Allah can judge. Walt Whitman, the famous American poet, had the phrase, be curious, not judgmental. So the question with respect to the people you come in contact with is not, do you like them? Do you respect them? Do you think they're going to, get reincarnated in the right place or not? But are they important for your career? Are they in a position where they can make or break you? And if they are, you need to figure out a way to build a positive relationship with them. You need people sponsoring you who can be helpful to you in your career. Most of us spend way too much time talking to our close friends. Our close friends, as I said once to a group of people in my class, if you spend all your time talking to your close friends, how will you ever make other friends? So you need, we know from the social science literature, which Rita knows better than I, weak ties are important. You need to be in contact with a lot of people, not just the people who you work with closely or your close friends. So relationships are important. That's number one. Number two, we've already alluded to it. You need to become somewhat less judgmental. I think number three, there's social psychological research on this, and there's Malcolm Gladwell's wonderful New Yorker article titled How David Beats Goliath. How does David beat Goliath? David beats Goliath by breaking the rules. And you need to be willing to break the rules. Whole Foods broke the rules. The rules in groceries were, buy minimized costs. And for that, you should have the same stock assortment in every store. And Whole Foods figured out that people would pay more for food they wanted to eat, and that the tastes were different in Boston and Austin and San Francisco. So they empowered their departments in the store to build stock that suited the local taste. Southwest Airlines figured out that you only actually made money when people were in the air, not when they were waiting number 26 in line to take off at Dallas. And so they have this idea of rapid turnaround and not assigned seating, etc. And you could go down the list. So in both strategy, I mean, certainly no strategy professor would say there are 1,000 companies doing X. The way you're going to succeed is to do X. but in the world of careers, we say everybody is doing X. We should do the same thing. I don't think that's exactly right. I'm famous for telling my students at Stanford that they should probably not get a job in a high-tech company in Northern California, where they will be surrounded by people exactly like themselves, and that if they have come from Chile or Kazakhstan, where actually one person did come from, or whatever country they are, if they go back to that country with a degree and with the education that comes from an elite US business school, they are probably going to be a much more differentiated product, have much more comparative advantage than to go to Google when you're going to be one of like 100 Stanford MBAs who graduated that year. So you need to be willing to break the rules. You need to be willing to differentiate yourself. You need to be willing to stand out. And the other thing I tell people is that they cannot be afraid of or shy away from conflict. Our current president, I think, is an example of this, but he probably takes it to an extreme. But you have to be willing. You have to be willing to fight and stand up for what you believe in, as I know you do, as I know all of my colleagues do. And in the words of my friend Gary Loveman, who used to run Harrah's Entertainment, then he was a senior executive at Aetna. He came to my class. It's on video. I love it. It's my favorite line of all visitors I think who have ever come to my class. He said, if you want to be liked, get a dog. A dog will like you unconditionally. You can come home. The dog will wag his tail and be happy to see you. Your job as a senior executive is not to win a popularity contest. Mm-hmm. Your job as a senior executive is to make the difficult decisions that will make your organization successful. And, and so I think you have to be, that's related to rule breaking, it's slightly different. You have to be tough enough to say, my job is to get this organization, particularly in times of crisis, through to the other side. And this is not necessarily going to involve doing something that everybody's going to agree with.
Yeah. Ben Horowitz talks about peacetime leaders and wartime leaders. And that, peacetime leaders, it's all about kumbaya and creativity and great ideas. And he has a wonderfully memorable phrase about something like a wartime leader will worry about a flea on a gnat's ass if it means the success of the company. One other story that this brings to mind is indeed about Keith. So Keith Ferrazzi, for those who don't know him, very famous sort of guy. How would you describe him? He's sort of
marketing guru. He's a marketing guru.
So he tells a story about how in his first job, and apparently he was quite a sought after employee, he told them he would accept that job, but under one condition. And the condition was, if I recall properly, that once a month he would get to spend some time, lunch or coffee break or something, with the CEO of the company. And the company, I guess, got taken by surprise, and they said, well, okay, if that's what it takes to get you here. And he followed through on that. And again, back to your point of differentiation, you're the only 20-something with a regular audience with the most powerful person in the organization. What a differentiator, right?
And I think it also illustrates something that my friend Frank Flynn, who used to teach at Columbia, now is at Stanford, wrote a paper with Vanessa Lake. And the title of the paper is, If You Want Help, Just Ask. We as human beings, I think, want to believe that we're self-reliant, and we think it shows weakness to ask, and therefore we don't ask for enough. And what you don't ask, you don't get. Anybody in sales understands this. If you don't ask for the sale, you'll never get it. If you don't ask for the upgrade, you won't get it. If you don't ask, for, if we're in a hotel or an airport, airline, and a friend of mine, said to me, as a matter of fact, I think he said this. He said, if you don't ask, you won't get it. What's the worst that can happen if you, let's say Keith had asked, for the dinner once a year with Pat LeConto, the head of Deloitte Consulting. The worst he could have said was no. Well, Keith wouldn't have had dinner with him. He wasn't going to have dinner with him anyway. So, I mean, the worst that can happen is no. So people need to, I think, be bolder about what they ask for.
Yeah, I would agree. And coming back to the women in leadership thing again.
I think that's a big issue with women.
Oh, huge. I mean, the pull you have to do to get them to say, yes, I would like that job, or yes, I'm ready for that promotion, or yes, I'd be willing to do something. So we had the great pleasure of having Sharon Price John in as a guest in the class, and she is the CEO of Build-A-Bear Workshop. And she's wonderful. She's got like this just very affable sort of Southern charm, but she really means business at the top of the company. And one of the women in the class was like, well, should I ask for a promotion? And Sharon just kind of looked at her and said, well, of course. The worst that'll happen is you don't get it, but now at least they know that you're interested. And if there's a pattern of them not recognizing your potential, then you're better off going somewhere else. So yes, of course, be prepared to be your own best advocate is kind of the way that we think about it. Now, one of the things that comes up a lot when we think about leadership and power, and the late Jack Welch was an archetype of a certain kind of leader that often gets associated with being very powerful. And then in the other corner, we have the sort of level 5 leaders that Jim Collins talks about, the ones that have deep humility and introspection and all that kind of thing. So how do we bring those two things together?
Well, that's a fabulous question. I will remind you, and my numbers are going to be off, but not by much, that of the 1,400 and something companies that Jim Collins studied, there were approximately 11 level 5 leaders. So Jim Collins was studying unicorns, and probably in the true sense of unicorns. There are some level, and Jim Collins, who by the way endorsed my power book, I said, why are you willing to endorse the book on power? He said, even the level 5 leaders turned out not to be so level 5 as they were rising to the leadership role.
Oh, they got religion after they got there.
They got religion after they got there. Sometimes what you have to do to get in the job is different than what you want to do once you're in the job. That's for number one. But it's a question I get. It's a question I got from my editor, who said, Adam Grant talks about give and take. And I said, you need to read Adam Grant's Give and Take book very carefully, in which Adam Grant carefully says there are many more takers than givers. So I think we need to be, I think one of the problems, well, there are many problems, but one of the problems with management and leadership education is we will take an exceptional individual, and there are some, and maybe Bob Chapman, or Barry Wehmiller, or maybe the founder of Patagonia, whatever, and we hold them up as a model, and that's fine. But I would never say, if we were studying medicine, I would never say, I have a patient who had metastatic pancreatic cancer, and they spontaneously remissed, and they cured that, which, by the way, will happen. Doesn't happen often, but there is spontaneous remission, even for metastatic pancreatic cancer. Medicine, unlike management, is going to build a science based upon the mean, if you will, or on the most common, or what the probability distribution is. Management tends to want to build a science based upon the very, 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 very rare exceptions. And it's fine to talk about the very rare exceptions, but you need to place them in the context of where they are in the distribution of behavior. Yes, there are people who, I'm sure, to go back to the example that you just used from the Build-A-Bear, I'm sure there are people who've gotten promoted by being very modest, keeping their head down, and never asking for anything. The odds of that are low. So management and understanding how you need to behave is really very much like going to Las Vegas. It is completely possible to go to Las Vegas and to throw, a heads, 20 times in a row. It is not how you want to make your living. I think we need to be sensitive to the distribution of behaviors and what tends to work most of the time, and not overemphasize the exceptional cases.
Mhm, mhm. One of the other things I find frustrating, and I know you've written about this as well, is you can do stupid, poorly thought through, idiotic things and be enormously successful because for whatever reason, you're standing in the right place at the right time. You know, you've got tailwinds at your back and it all is great. And you can be as thoughtful and careful. And I'll use a specific example. Take Disney, right? I mean, Bob Iger was supposed to go out in a blaze of glory. He'd laid his legacy. He'd gotten them into streaming. The business was firing on all cylinders. And now, you know, and so one of the things that I find frustrating in management teaching as well is if a company gets into trouble, everything it ever did was stupid. And if a company's successful, everything it ever did was sheer brilliance. And so I'm going to build a bonfire one of these days of all the case studies, you know, the Harvard case studies about General Electric and Nokia and Dell. Remember, you could not move in one of our classrooms at Columbia for about a decade without tripping over Dell, Dell case studies. And so one of the things I really encourage our listeners to think about is, you know, come to an independent conclusion about the goodness, if you will, of a set of processes or decisions without being completely influenced by their outcome. So, you know, Phil Rosenzweig calls this the halo effect. And, you know, and we're always making decisions on the basis of the halo effect and not on kind of what came before. And I know you point this out often, but that kind of counterintuitive, like, you know, paying people badly does not mean you're economizing on your labor costs. I mean, we tend to correlate the wrong things, I think sometimes.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And, you know, and you can fix process, but you can fix, but you really can't fix outcomes. So I can fix your golf swing, weight shift, grip pressure, and shoulder rotation. And if you fix the process, the outcome will probably be better. But I just had hip replacement surgery, unfortunately, and just about 8 months ago, I had a cervical spine fusion. And when I evaluate doctors, I almost never, I do ask them about their outcomes, but what I mostly ask them about is the process. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a doctor who has consistently good outcomes, there's a process behind that. Mm-hmm. It's the same thing with, you know, with flying. The reason why flying is safe is not because we have a bunch of exceptional pilots. It's because we have an exceptional set of processes that can make almost anybody a great pilot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I thought as we move towards wrapping up that I'd love you to talk a little bit about your book with Bob Sutton, The Knowing Doing Gap, because so many things in life are really simple to understand. You know, like you want to lose weight, eat less, move more. I mean, how complicated is that, right? But I think in the book, you really get into some of the things that, you know, we all know that, fill in blank. And then you ask somebody, do you act on it? And they kind of look at you like, well, of course not. So maybe if you could elaborate on some of the themes from that book, that would be a kind of an interesting way
Sure. So we want to understand why organizations spend all this time pursuing knowledge, hiring fancy consultants, reading all kinds of stuff, going to 1 billion seminars, and seldom implementing what they learned. And we found, of course, a number of things. Number one, which is a common problem in today's world, and I think COVID has probably made it worse, is that oftentimes talk substitutes for action. People believe that if you talk about it, if you have meetings about it, if you decide it, it's the same as doing it. So, you know, how many companies have had meetings about becoming more customer-centric and seminars on becoming more customer-centric and, you know, speakers on becoming more customer-centric. But actually, if you want to become more customer-centric, you not only need to listen and figure all this stuff out, but you actually need to do it. You can't just, you know, you can't just talk about it. So oftentimes, I think talk substitutes for action. I think that's one of the big issues. Oftentimes, memory substitutes for thinking. We are trapped by our past. We are trapped by what we have always done. We're trapped by conventional wisdom and what everybody else does. And, you know, and so, you know, you do what you've always done. You see this, I have a friend who runs One Medical, which is this primary care clinic. And I think one of the things that makes Amir Rubin an exceptional CEO is he refuses to be trapped by anything. He said, if the physician burnout, of course, is an enormous problem, as everybody knows. Last year, there was more than one physician suicide per day. 500 physicians killed themselves. He said, if I'm going to build a successful primary care practice, I have to have physicians who don't quit. And therefore, I'm going to throw open basically every aspect of primary care practice. You know, everybody uses Epic, which is famous. It's the #1 medical record system. Everybody hates it. He said to his people, he says, we're going to hire 100 software engineers and we're going to get rid of Epic. Everybody hates it. To hell with it. We don't need it. We will build our own. So we will basically do, so everybody knows user-centered product design. He does user-centered job design.
Yeah.
So it's the same principle. It's the same idea. So if I said to you, Rita, you need to build a phone that you like, you would do all the things that IDEO and everybody else does to do rapid prototyping, to testing, and to make the design user-centered. He said, we're going to do user-centered work design. So we are going to start. There's certain things that have to be done. We have to be clean. We have to be this. We have to be that. But beyond that, we are going to figure out how to build a primary care practice that works not only for the patients, but also for the providers. And that requires you to basically be willing to throw away conventional wisdom in history. To say, you know, everybody does X. Well, who cares? Everybody does X. Physicians are burning out. Maybe you shouldn't do X.
Exactly.
And so this idea of leaving, of being willing to look beyond conventional wisdom, to look beyond your past, and to reinvent a clean sheet of paper, whatever phrase you want to use, and is I think, of course, a smart thing to do if you want to put knowledge into action. And the third thing we found, of course, is that fear prevents acting on knowledge. People are terrified to do anything because they're afraid they're going to be fired, because they're afraid that they're going to be criticized. They're afraid they're going to, stand out in some unfortunate way. And so Deming's first principle, I think, is exactly right. Drive out fear. It is the #1 thing if you want to turn knowledge into action, or to build an effective organization. You certainly need to drive fear out of the organization. And a fourth big issue is measurement. We measure the wrong things. I mean, we talked earlier about dying for a paycheck. One of the big issues is that most organizations don't measure the health of their workforce. So, they may measure absenteeism, but they don't measure, they don't measure self-reported health. They don't measure, I said to people all the time, if you've got a benefits administrator, your benefits administrator could tell you, if you asked and if you wanted to hear, which divisions of your organizations are using the most antidepressants, the most sleeping pills. You could know which parts of your organization are in the most mental distress, from where they're taking the most psychotropics. So why don't you measure, why don't you measure, and why don't you maybe evaluate people? So if I hire Rita McGrath to be my manager, one of the criteria I'm going to use is what happens to sleeping pill and antidepressant use pre and post Rita. It's an interesting idea to think about, using measures that measure things that really are consistent with what we think are important.
And you don't have to do that. There was a comment about that doesn't need to be tied to an individual, but it could be at a division level. Or I think that's brilliant. I had never thought of that. That's a really good idea.
There you go.
So what are you working on these days, aside from recovering from various encounters with the medical establishment?
So I think, I'm working on a number of projects, but I think my next book is going to be on fixing the US healthcare system, which I believe is astonishingly easy.
Really?
Astonishingly easy,
Oh,
yes.
okay. I want to hear it first. How?
And the premise of the book is actually easy. In a fundamentally employer-based healthcare system, which it is, We have Medicare and Medicaid, of course, but about half the people in the United States get medical care through their employers. And I've sat on Stanford committees for years and other committees which does this. The employers, basically, if the employers wanted to solve every problem in the US healthcare system, they could. And so the mystery that I'm currently interviewing people about is why they are so passive, why they have not demanded more from their benefits administrators, why they have not demanded more from the benefits consultants, why, in the words of Jeff Immelt, the former CEO of GE, who was one of the people I interviewed, he said, he says, we were spending $3 billion a year at GE on healthcare. And he said, I didn't pay any attention to it. And that, he said, as soon as I paid attention to it, things got better. But the inside is so many senior leaders aren't paying attention, aren't asking for the right performance metrics, aren't asking for the right outcomes, aren't measuring the right things. So I'm actually making pretty good progress on this.
So I have someone you should talk to. So this is a guy by the name of Todd Bisping. He's a supply chain expert. He works for Caterpillar. And what he did was he had a mandate from, on high to figure out how Caterpillar could begin to rein in, especially their prescription drug costs. And they just decided to start there because that was the easiest thing, not, elective procedures and all that. And he came at this with a supply chain mindset. And he just said every single transaction along the supply chain, we're going to do something about. And, really beginning with the benefits managers, the pharmacy benefit managers. And what's fascinating about it is they have actually kept Caterpillar's, they've bent the cost curve on all of those things because they took control of it. And he said something I thought was really memorable, which was, he said, I'm the one paying all the bills and I'm the one with the least transparency into how this money is spent. So if I'm going to be paying the bills, I'm going to demand a lot more from these providers.
But he's an exception, and I would love for you to introduce me to him by email.
I will. He's great.
Thank you.
And you can note of that. So where can people learn more if they want to be part of your world?
So I have a website, jeffreypfeffer.com. It's hard to, not too hard to find. I tweet it at Jeffrey Pfeffer, and mostly I post on LinkedIn. And so, yeah, and the Cornerstone on Demand column, which you mentioned, is I repost all my Cornerstone on Demand columns on, which is called Rework, I guess. I'll repost that on LinkedIn. So, that's, I guess, if you want to be part of my world, that's probably the best way to follow me. And prior to COVID, you can actually come out to Stanford and visit me, and maybe those days will happen again where we can see each other in person as opposed to just on the screen.
Yeah, we were, before this conversation started, we were whining about Zoom. Zoom is just such an inadequate medium.
Well, the virtual, I think a lot of colleges are about to find this out. Virtual instruction is not the same as on-campus instruction. And of course, Stanford and I'm sure Columbia, when you've put out the brochures, you have talked about the beauty of the campus and the dining facilities and the gymnasium and the interpersonal random interactions and all. And now, of course, everybody needs to remarket because what we've marketed on the past, we can no longer deliver, at least temporarily.
At least for the time being, yeah. And as a closing thought, there was one of our listeners who said, well, once you're done with healthcare, could you move on to higher education?
I'd be happy to.
A worthy task for all of us.
Thank you.
Well, Jeff, this has been an absolute pleasure. So I'll visit you on a Zoom call sometime soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And do remember to make the introduction, because I really would like to talk to him.
He's great. He's amazing. Okay, I'll let you know. Right. Bye, everybody.